Hello, I'm Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance, and I want to thank you all for coming today. We've got an exciting program about a part of the country I wish I could visit a lot more, which is Colorado in the Front Rail Project. First, for those who are new to the High Speed Rail Alliance, we are a member-supported nonprofit. We advocate, we help people understand what high-speed rail is, what regional rail is, how they work together, why we need to build high-frequency passenger rail, what steps can be taken in order to make significant progress towards a federal railway program that builds it across the country, and help provide the tools that you can use that educate your leaders about this need and these steps we can take. We are member supported, so a little bit of a pitch first. The first person today who donates, I went into the prize closet and we have a little display model, the Japanese N700. The first person who makes says in the chat they want it and then goes to hsrail.org/donate and makes a donation. You do those two steps and we'll send you that model today. And for everyone else, if you like this presentation and you want to see more of them, please donate as well. We've got an exciting program, and Chris Sott, the Deputy Director up in Madison, is going to introduce our speakers.
Great, thanks, Rick, and thanks everyone for being here today. Just a couple of basics about the Zoom for those who might not have joined us before. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, put it in there, and if you just have a comment, put it in the chat, and then after the presentation, we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. But for now, just let's introduce our speakers today. Jim Souby is the chairman of the Front Range Passenger Rail District's board. He has extensive experience in public management, policy development, and planning as the chief executive of a regional governors association, a national policy and planning association, and in other roles, as well as private sector experience in small business and nonprofits. He has served on the Front Range Passenger Rail District Board since being appointed by Colorado's governor in 2022, and was also appointed to serve on 2 rail commissions for the region. He has been the president of the Colorado Passenger Rail Association since 2010, has served on the board of the National Association of Railroad Passengers, and in 2016, he received the Amtrak President's Safety and Public Service Award. Also with us today is Andy Karsian, the general manager of the Front Range Passenger Rail District. Previously, he served as the Colorado DOT's legislative liaison for almost a decade, where he formed coalitions with legislators and local communities to advance transportation policy. Before his time at CDOT, he was the political liaison at Colorado Counties Incorporated. He's a Colorado native and has degrees from Metropolitan State University of Denver and Regis University. And in addition to his policy and legislative work, Andy has supported refugees and immigrants in the Denver metro area, served in the Peace Corps in Armenia, and managed a downtown jazz and blues bar. That is a great example of the kind of nightlife that we want people to be able to take trains to enjoy. So with that, let me turn things over to our speakers.
Andy, do you want to, why don't we have our GM as the man who is running the show here in Colorado? He has a presentation to make, and I hope that will generate questions and answer quite a few questions. So Andy, take over.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you to Rick and Chris and everybody who's there. I see in the chat that we've got people from Berkeley, California, and Utah and others. So it is an absolute pleasure to be here today to speak to you all, to give you an update on what we are doing here in Colorado on Front Range Passenger Rail. I hope that you all can see the screen for the presentation. Is that good,
Great, yeah.
Chris? Good. Yes. Good. So I am going to go through this presentation fairly quickly. I know that you all know a lot about rail. A lot of some of these slides may be old news to you all, so I'm going to go through fairly quickly because we'd rather have a conversation with you all and answer the questions that you all have on where we're at. So again, thank you so much for being here today. We are planning new transportation options for the district and for the region in this in the area. It's an exciting opportunity for us to be in. The Front Range Passenger Rail is a new taxing district that was created by the Colorado legislature in 2021. It is a local government. We do have the ability to raise taxes upon approval of the voters, and we'll speak to that here in just a bit. The focus or the mission, the legislative direction for the district is to finance, design, construct, operate passenger rail service along the Front Range. It's a new project, a new opportunity, as I mentioned. We haven't had this in Colorado. It's we don't have the rail culture and the rail programs that many of you all have that are listening in today. So this is truly a new thing for us to communicate to everybody in this district. So it's a fascinating and challenging opportunity. And then just a final spot there, working with our local communities, obviously a key in working around station development. Jim is on our board and one of the governor appointees. We also have 10 representatives coming from local governments and the NPOs they appoint. Those are the NPOs that are included in the district and part of the district. 6 governor appointees. CDOT, our Department of Transportation for the state, is on the board. And then we have some key ex officio members, such as the freight rails, BNSF and UP are the freight rails that are part of that make up the infrastructure in the district. Amtrak RTD is our regional transit district that runs light rail as well as buses, and they're an essential partner with us for a couple of reasons, which we'll get into. I-70 corridor, and then of course New Mexico and Wyoming, as we look to expanding up into those areas as well. The history of the Front Range, Jim was instrumental in getting us to where we are today and a part of many of these milestones as we got to developing the district in 2021. But you can see that there has been decades of planning around this. As you all know, it's not a fast thing to do planning for a rail project, especially when there has never been a rail project in the state. So the years of planning centered around a really impetus around saving the Southwest Chief and working with Amtrak and BNSF on some of the continuing service that comes through Southern Colorado and taps into Trinidad. And the Rail Commission was a key entity that started coalescing the planning and the administration around moving passenger rail efforts forward, which culminated into some key planning efforts. Then, as I mentioned, the district was created in 21. You all know this, passenger rail, Front Range Passenger Rail. It's a new intercity system. You all familiar with that? It does go through Pueblo, from Pueblo to Fort Collins. And I do see a question here is why was it terminating in Pueblo? Makes a lot more sense to go to Trinidad. It absolutely does. So right now, the federal service development plan that we have going on is from Pueblo to Fort Collins, but we absolutely have the intention of extending that down into Trinidad, which is a key portion of the district, as well as down into New Mexico and Cheyenne eventually, which I just said. And then, of course, we are using existing infrastructure to start off with, as opposed to establishing a whole new range. And we can talk more about that as well. Again, familiar to many of you, commuter rail versus intercity rail. We have this slide in here because this is not familiar to many in Colorado and in this region. And we have some commuter rail in existence now with the RTD that I mentioned before, who is an ex officio on our board. That commuter rail system pretty much ties the Denver metro area together. One of the branches that was part of an expansion from a prior vote of the voters that they approved was called Fast Tracks, and a Fast Tracks expansion was for commuter rail. Part of that commuter rail line includes the route that was approved by the Front Range Passenger Rail District Board. So we are collaborating with RTD to kind of see how do we bring that commuter line and passenger line along that portion of the passenger rail corridor as well, which is an interesting conversation, as you can imagine. But as we continue to educate the voters and the future riders in our district around the difference, obviously fewer stations, longer distances, faster service for the intercity rail. This no surprise as well for many of you in your regions, growing need for transportation. This really represents a new option for Colorado to have passenger rail in this region, provides an opportunity for additional connectivity, a variety of different opportunities, also with greenhouse gas, air quality emissions, connecting those major markets along the region, affording opportunities for tourism, and of course, better livability for a variety of different folks. You are all familiar with the IIJA dollars. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's one of the real reasons why we're having these conversations in Colorado, maximizing our opportunity, leveraging some of those state dollars to draw down those federal dollars. Here are some, of those opportunities. Connecting Coloradans, as we talked about, this is kind of the key vision of what we are providing and what the district is looking at, opportunities for the region, as I mentioned, to increase that kind of a more holistic backbone of transit connections, building off of a passenger rail system, utilizing those first and last miles, those existing transit services that are available today in the variety of different local governments and catchment areas along the corridor. The benefits of passenger rail I've alluded to in the past, right? Economic vitality is an interesting one that we didn't discuss yet, centering around how do we develop the stations with those local communities? What does that bring? And what is the scope of that station and the depth of what they want to have? And how do we help them make that happen? So where we are today, you all are familiar with this, the Corridor ID program, as well as that service development plan. We're right here, right in about that beginning part. Our service development plan will probably be done about the middle or end of next year. It's a little bit delayed, as many things are, as we go through our infrastructure projects, whether it's rail or highway or whatever it is. Nothing ever goes as planned, as you know. So we are here at the service development planning process. There are a lot of considerations that we have here in Colorado. It's not necessarily a linear planning process. Things happen. There are new programs that are developing. How does the Corridor ID program interface with the service development plan? When a DOT is doing our service development plan, which they are, the CDOT here in Colorado is doing our service development plan because that started before the district or right when the district was created. And so they took that on as some technical support. But the district is the sole sponsor in the Corridor ID. So we need to obviously work with FRA and the DOT and the district all together to continue that as we go along. Then, of course, you get into the financing strategies and moving into those future NEPA conversations as well. I just alluded to the service development plan. You all are familiar with the service development plan. It gives us that kind of market analysis, the business plan for the feds, to show that we know what we're doing, that we've spoken to our freight railroads and we're doing our homework. It is an interesting conversation to have when you have two different railroads, one to the north, one to the south of Denver, and just kind of two different conversations as you have. It's not a full-on one freight railroad, and so we have to kind of bifurcate the policy discussions, the politics, and the negotiations as well. And that has led to some delays in the planning process, as I mentioned before. Not unsurprising and par for course. Corridor ID program, the district was accepted into that last year. As you know, we were accepted into it on a step 2, which was very exciting for us, and also a challenge for us, as you can imagine, because if you're accepted into step 2, that kind of implies that the service development plan has come along with you. You're ready to go, and you're going to identify that gap of where you are on the service development plan and where we are now in order to move forward. That is more of a challenge than you would think, especially in regards to that Northwest Rail corridor that I mentioned before, that we are going to partner for commuter rail and passenger rail. There's a whole policy discussion going around with the state and the governor on that, which I can get into. So it does create some complexities when we go through the planning and the policy around that. But we are excited to be a part of the Corridor ID and looking forward to developing the benefits associated with that. I alluded to this before, and it's just kind of a partnership and local coordination. It's a key if not the most important part of what we do as a district is, a new entity, a large entity, a taxing entity that has a specific focus on developing and implementing a major infrastructure project for the state around passenger rail. Obviously, we need to partner and work with a whole host of folks from local governments, state, federal, transit providers. Everybody on here is a key player and has a chance to make or break as we move ahead on the conversations. Some of our priorities moving forward, as you can imagine, ongoing collaboration with our stakeholders, building coalitions to support that. It's also part of an education of a rare rail culture here in the state, as I alluded to before, that doesn't have a sense of really what intercity passenger rail can provide with those higher speeds and greater distances. What we are used to are those shorter speeds and connecting those commuter rails. And so it's a fascinating conversation when we go and talk to the communities, because they only know commuter rail. And so their sense of a station is a commuter rail. And so they want to have many, many stations and take advantage of the opportunity of stations, just like it always has been with the rail from the beginning of time. So, helping them understand what a primary and secondary station is, and travel speeds, and FRA versus FTA, and rolling stock differences. It's been a very interesting conversation, as you can imagine. Increasing the capacity for the district, obviously, to create the opportunities and to be able to respond to the opportunities. We started off with me when Jim and the board hired me as the general manager back in the end of 21. Now we have 5 staff. We just moved into our new office, so we are slowly building up the capacity, but obviously a lot of that is dependent upon the ballot measure that we must pass in order to get those tax revenues here in Colorado to build the project. Federal money through the IIJA obviously is an important part as well. Here's my information. My chief of staff, Chrissy, is also a key individual that you can reach out to if you have any questions. And that, for me, was the end of the presentation. And Rick, we'd be delighted to answer any questions that folks may have.
Excellent, and thank you very much. I'm sorry, suddenly I'm focused on the door being open instead of what I'm supposed to be thinking about. I missed something, and then you said we could talk about it more. The Northwest commuter line and doing this jointly. Can you go into a little bit more details about that?
Absolutely, and then I'll start, and Jim can probably correct me. We, about 20 years ago now, roughly, there was a ballot measure that the Regional Transportation District, the transit district that serves the Denver metro area, passed. And that ballot measure included an expansion of services for the RTD, including bus services, but also included a lot of kind of commuter light rail expansion. One of the expansion projects that was included in the list of possibilities for the voters was this line between Denver and Boulder, and kind of including up along the track. And as a matter of fact, I will very quickly, just to help illustrate this, show you a map of what I'm talking about so that you can see exactly what it is. So here's that. Here is our district. And you can see right now what I'm talking about is this line. If you can see my cursor, and maybe I can make that bigger, but you can see what I'm talking about is there was a vote to provide service up to here, right along that corridor. But unfortunately, what happened was the amount of money that they approved was not enough to actually build out the service. And so people have voted for a tax for a train, but they never got a train. Fast forward about 15, 20 years later, here comes the Front Range Passenger Rail District. And we're like, hey, here we are with a train. Here's our corridor. The board approved this as the route for the corridor. Guess what? That overlays what the Fast Tracks ballot already had. So we are looking to partner with the RTD on utilizing some of those dollars they have in a Fast Track savings account to leverage towards some of the capital construction at the beginning of this, in order to try and start partnering around how do we develop a joint service for that portion of the northern corridor as part of a phase one. That wasn't necessarily a part of the original discussion where we were looking at the whole thing and discussed it in our service development plan as a whole project. But now, because of a variety of different reasons, this joint collaboration being one of them, we've identified the northern portion of the district as a phase, the first phase, and we're having conversations with FRA about how do we implement that into our service development plan and get that phase underway as we continue to look at the whole district. Rick, I know that was a whole bunch of information, and I hope that I answered your question.
Well, it leads me to a different question, and I'm sorry to be kind of too detail focused on this, but the commuter rail system is dedicated electrified tracks. So is the first phase dedicated electrified tracks north of Colorado, or is it still shared use and then maybe later?
That
Shared
hasn't
use
been
and major-
decided yet. I'll chip in.
Okay.
This conversation's been going on for many years. The current RTD general manager is on our board, but this conversation started with the prior general manager, who we used to have coffee with twice a month, and we were trying to figure out what to do about the Northwest line. And this whole idea of a joint powers authority or something like that came up. And we went out to California and looked at some of their models and brought that all back home. And then the commission took up this notion that Northwest Rail ought to be the preferred route. Our legislature put in legislation that this would be the preferred route, but we as the board have the final statutory decision-making authority on that issue as well as all the other related rail issues. So the jury's out on it, but I think the board probably doesn't see this as us sharing an electrified line with RTD. I would hope, although this has not yet been decided, that we would have a mutually agreeable equipment on that line, shared maintenance and things like that. Andy can talk to this in much greater detail, but issues come up if you're not careful about how you operate and collaborate with the commuter rail system. You all suddenly have all kinds of different platform issues you have to contend with. You have the overhead, electrification issues that you might not want to build for 300 miles, but they might want to build for 75. And you might not be able to run certain kinds of equipment if they're running that kind of equipment. So the question is a loaded one, Rick, as you probably already knew. And Andy, but the great thing about it is, Andy already touched on this. These are fascinating conversations, and most of our public citizens don't have the slightest idea that these problems and questions exist. So first we have to let them know that these questions exist, and then we have to adequately answer them in order to get the voters to support a sales tax. Let me turn it over to Andy. He can tell you what's really going on.
Yeah. Great answers. I think that, the only addition I'll have on that is there is a bill during the legislative session, which ends at the beginning of May here in Colorado. It's 120 days. So we're getting near the end of it. And one of the bills that looks like it's going to pass does provide direction to Front Range Passenger Rail District, CDOT, and RTD to start into negotiations and conversations around what could a joint authority. It could be everything from an IGA, an intergovernmental agreement that we have together, all the way to creating kind of a joint power authority like they have in California. So we're going to be directed to do that for this first phase that Jim was just talking about.
Okay. And the last time we tried,
and Rick, and let me comment another thing. We believe, and I think RTD believes, that we could actually generate all kinds of much more efficient service, both commuter and intercity, if we collaborated and worked together on these questions. So if I made it sound like this is unlikely, the fact of the matter is the leaders involved in all this think we ought to go ahead and do it, including our governor and our legislature, I think. So I would say some kind of a collaborative agreement is definitely going to happen here. And I just hope it really does bring to bear all those efficiencies.
Okay. And we do, as a country, have to figure out the platform height issue. Maybe there should be 2 standard platform heights and a rolling stock that actually works at both 48 inches and at 15 inches or 8, whatever it is. So you don't have to deal with that issue. But And I was about to say, when we last really did a big corridor like this, it was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad, so they didn't have to collaborate. They just said 48 inches.
That's
And,
right. That's
you
right.
know.
Well, you need to welcome us aboard.
Well, and then we kind of touched on in the initial uh, alternatives analysis, there was dedicated electrified line in the alternatives analysis, correct? I was told
That was an option. It wasn't a decision. The alternatives analysis was just a feasibility study. It was
okay,
a very powerful study. Don't get me wrong. I was on that commission, but it didn't answer a lot of these questions. It said, what are the questions, and does it make sense to try to answer them and move forward on a project? And in fact, the answer was yes. Our legislature agreed, and so did the FRA. So, you know, it was a valuable study, but it did not provide these answers. It said these are the questions we need to answer.
okay. And then you had a slide where you showed all the different uses and the connections that are being made between folks. Those people travel at different times of the day. So frequency becomes very important. How do you decide how frequent the trains are going to be?
It's a great question, and we're in the process of doing that right now. So through our service development plan and with our conversations with the freight railroads, you know, as you know, one of the challenges that sometimes happens is getting data from freight railroads. And so we have worked through that. We have started getting that data. And so we are beginning to develop the modeling around that. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, I was on a call that showed some very interesting stringline diagrams around what we have north of Denver and then what we have south of Denver. North of Denver is BNSF. Generally, the freight traffic is less than south of Denver, and that was shown on the diagrams as well. So to answer your question, what we are looking at and started where we're starting the conversation is utilizing the existing infrastructure. So that constrains us a little bit on how much frequency we can have, obviously working with the freight railroads. Starting smaller with around 6 round trips a day is generally what we're thinking to start off with, but we're also going through some modeling and having discussions with the public around what their expectations are for frequency as well. Because again, the politics around this, we want to be able to serve the public. And it's interesting, we are hearing generally that they are willing to pay a little bit more money for a better service. They don't necessarily just want and we're not going to provide this, but a bare bones service to start one train in order to get it going and then move it. That's not where we're going to go. But with 6 round trips, it's generally kind of a sweet spot that we have seen through past studies and discussions with the freight railroads in order to find that sweet spot to be able to deliver that level of frequency and service. Above that, when we start going south of Denver, becomes more complex because of the freight traffic. North of Denver, it's still, we've got some built-in flexibility there to maybe get us up to a 10. But much more than that is going to really start, depending on the freight rail and be dependent upon the traffic. But Jim,
So,
anything to add on that from earlier?
No, I think that's accurate. We looked at the commission, the feasibility study looked at, as Andy referred to it, I hate this term, bare bones. So does the public, by the way. They're not going to vote for a bare bones system, I'll tell you that much. But we did look at, oh God, we looked at states, we looked at up to 24 round trips, but we settled on bookends of say 6 to 14, as I recall. It was in that neighborhood as being feasible and financeable. Andy should talk a little bit about our initial polling. It's not the final polling, but it did show that the public is more than willing to pay more than the lowest rate we might bring forward in order to get more trips and more service. So that's an important attribute. It isn't just the service, it's what will the public pay for. And then obviously we have to generate fair estimates and all that kind of stuff too. But I think Andy should talk about that because that poll was very encouraging.
it was fascinating, and we have a follow-up poll to kind of stress test some of the numbers because they came in so positively. But we generally are seeing a high 60s, low 70% support for a project of this nature along the Front Range of those that we polled. And to Jim's point, when we talk about the sales tax, which I think there's a question over here around what would we ask for, it would be a sales and use tax. We are statutory limited to get up to, I think I'm going to say this right, Jim, 8 cents on a $10 purchase. So a 0.08 type sales tax. That would be the maximum. We did some finding, it's a large district. It encompasses 85% of the state's population. So there's a large tax base of which to draw from. So that also is a nice opportunity for the district to actually generate the revenue necessary in order to pay for the project, which is some of the challenges that some of the projects have had in the past. So yes, initial polling is looking favorable.
Well, and then when we were talking earlier, you had 3 Ps. And I think you kind of started hitting on that, of how you have to manage planning, policy, and politics together.
So one thing, and I'm new to this, my chair, Jim, has been involved with this for decades. And whenever I talk to him, he always reminds me of all of the nuances that he's gone through with planning and projects and politics in the past as well. And then as I talk to other corridors around the country now in my capacity, I'm finding out that Colorado Front Range is a pretty unique beast right now, where we've got our planning, as I mentioned before, where the Department of Transportation is doing the service development plan for the district, and yet the district is part of the corridor ID. And then the negotiations with freight rails and a variety of other things has led to a few delays in the planning process. How does that impact us? What does that impact us as far as a narrative? When it goes to a policy discussion, say with some grass top leaders in the communities around a chamber, or building some supporters as we do on a local government level or state level. When we talk about the policy discussions at the state house, and what does it mean to have a joint authority discussion? What does it mean to prioritize at first phase, which obviously bleeds into the 3rd P of politics, and trying to can't control it. There's no controlling it, but herd the cats of the politics and the policymakers towards a realistic expectation of what we are able to deliver, what can be a narrative that we can sell to the voters. And we haven't even talked about kind of the FRA and the federal aspect of it. How does all of what we're doing at this level inform the federal level in order to get the federal dollars and draw those down through the IIJA, and and have access to the availability to those? And so all of those 3 Ps, with the planning, the policy, and the politics, kind of come together. It's 3 balls that we always have up in the air that we're juggling at any given time. As you can imagine, a 180-mile corridor. There's a lot of diversity there for the policy as well as the politics. So it's a fascinating dynamic, which is leads to what shall we say, a non-standardized daily routine, I guess.
I like that, or I like the term. I'm not sure that it's a
I'm
good.
not sure it means anything, but
And then there was a question in, and then we'll go to audience questions. But there was an audience question that is near and dear to my heart. So there's this beautiful real estate development around Denver Union Station. It, in essence, saved the station so that it's available. And it was tied closely in with the commuter rail. So that's fantastic. I love the train shed. Haven't been there yet, but intend to. But they closed off the south end. So what do you do about that problem?
Well, thank you.
go ahead, Jim.
What we did about it, first of all, is we sued. Unfortunately, we sued under a NEPA statute, and we could not develop an environmental response about several issues. But the judge wrote a fabulous decision. I've got it filed somewhere. This was years ago, saying, and we sued over the fact there was no through track They had limited tracks to 8 rather than 11, which had been originally proposed, which would allow for great expansion of Front Range Rail. And without that through track, and we demonstrated to the court and to the city and to all the other powers that be how that could run, and it was wide open. And then they sold the real estate, and now that has office space on it, or residential apartment space on it, so it's gone. So yeah, that is an issue. We will have to run a back end, or we'll have to run have Front Range service to the south, or through service have a platform about 800 feet from Denver and Union Station. One of the two. Right now we're able to back trains in and out. As you know, Amtrak serves, but not just the Winter Park Express, but the California Zephyr. So they're able to get their trains in and out relatively efficiently, but probably some modifications in the 2 rail yards, BNSF and UP, will be necessary as well in order to speed up that process. But the engineering issues, we haven't addressed those yet. We're still just addressing how to finance this, and those will be part of our operational cost analysis. But it's Denver Union Station is a wonderful institution. It's fabulous, and the area, the development around it has been extremely powerful, and we use that as an advertisement for everybody's stations. Development around these stations naturally occurs. That's what we've learned from almost every other state we've consulted with. So that's a very powerful argument for this, but stations require very careful planning as well to make sure that they provide efficient service and interconnectivity for the first and last mile question.
Yeah, I unfortunately, as a young child, I committed to getting electrified trains back into Cleveland Union Terminal. And in 10 or 20 years ago, they sold off the the west approach into the station and built a multi-story federal courthouse. And I am committed to having that courthouse torn down. So maybe that's the answer in Denver.
We have to be careful about making those pronouncements here in Denver.
Oh, I'm sorry to bring that up.
No, there's a great lesson in it. This can be overcome. I mean, it's not going to totally hamper everything, and how many through trains will actually end up running and things like that have yet to even be determined. So it may not even be as big a problem as we might have thought it was going to be, but nevertheless, station planning is really critical to our success.
Excellent. Well, Chris, are there questions from the audience?
Yes, there are lots. And there's starting out, there's lots of interest in extending service outside Colorado and connections to Amtrak's long distance trains. Andy, you already spoke a bit about extending into New Mexico and Wyoming, but here are a couple related questions. Don asks, is there any thought about extending north of Cheyenne to Montana and connecting to the North Coast and Empire Builder trains? And then heading to the south, Brad asks, can the Southwest Chief be rerouted via Pueblo to provide direct connections to the Front Range service? Maybe outside your control, but
No. It's actually interesting because, for the first one it's definitely aspirational, but yes, right? First we got to get the Front Range passenger rail service, then we got to get it to Cheyenne. But yeah, absolutely. I think what really excites me is taking a look at, and I think over here in the chat, somebody's talking about utilizing rail as a system and not as individual lines. And I think this gets into that, to where we look at the rail map of the United States, and right there in Colorado and the kind of Middle West is empty. And how cool would it be to have that Northwest connection in order to build that out, and for the Front Range Rail to be the impetus for that? That would be amazing. And then for the second part with the through study, I think I just yesterday signed a grant agreement to start that process of the study for the Pueblo through car with Amtrak to start kicking that off. So that's been a conversation that we've been wanting to have for a number of years, that Jim started and we are now beginning to have. So yes to both of them.
Yeah, our legislation does advocate for rerouting the Southwest Chief. That made great sense to the prior commission, and way back when we were trying to save the Southwest Chief route through Colorado, that became an issue. and got tremendous political support from our senators in New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. Interestingly enough, that was 3 Republicans, very conservative, and 3 liberal Democrats who banded together. And we had joint meetings with them in Washington and took them on the Southwest Chief, their staffs, and they all supported this notion. So it just tells you, when you have the right arguments, how powerful politically this the rail system can be. And I agree with Andy that we have members, I have members, I'm sure you do too, from Montana. They're constantly talking about running the Helena to Denver route. The other thing that we're waiting to see and looking forward to is the completion of the FRA long distance study. And the initial results show that that restoring routes to Denver, I think something like 4 different routes to Denver would be a smart move for a national rail system. And so that'll have a big bearing, presuming any of that comes to pass. And that's all questionable because we don't know what's going to happen in DC in the future. But if any of that comes to pass, it really does amplify the value of front range rail and interconnectivity with the national system. So yeah, that stuff's definitely on our mind, although as Andy said, it's aspirational. We've got to convince the voters to pay the money to build our system in Colorado, and then we can connect. But Andy, you mentioned earlier, we have Wyoming and New Mexico on our board as ex officio members, and we do get inquiries from states further away.
All right, thank you. Next question comes from one of our board members, actually, Bill Porter, who incidentally did some early work to help set up this talk today. So thank you for that, Bill. And Bill asks, what was the most effective technique that the Front Range Passenger Rail District used to get the discussion of passenger rail started?
Oh, boy.
Great question.
Well,
Great question.
I'd say the Southwest Chief is what got our, Front Range Rail has been on our legislature's mind for many, many years. They've done resolutions in 2008, 2012. I mean, almost unanimous resolutions saying, hey, we need Front Range Rail. But I think what really generated the current interest is at least politically speaking, it was the Southwest Rail issue. Our legislature took that up, passed resolutions, passed three acts over the course of 8 years. And then the other thing, and then I'll turn it over to Andy because he has the broader outlook on this. But the other thing that really worked for us was getting people on trains. And we did that with the Southwest Chief. My advocacy group bought 24 tickets per trip. We took people from La Junta and Trinidad down to over Raton Pass and back. And many of these people had never ridden a train before. And then the other system we depended on was the Winter Park Express. And we would carry between 150 and 300 passengers up to Winter Park and back on the UP Moffett subdivision. And on the way back, we provide 6 hosts per train trip from the advocacy group. And one of the questions we talk to the passengers about is what is their feeling toward Front Range Rail? And I don't have any numbers for this year. We just ended last weekend our seasonal service to Winter Park. But in prior years, almost 50% of those passengers had never ridden a train before. And they were so impressed by the comfort and the convenience of riding on passenger rail that they would join ColoRail. We went from like 160 members to 1,011 members in like 3 years. I mean, it was unbelievable how powerful riding a train can be. So, and he knows we can't get every voting citizen on a train before the ballot issue comes up, but nevertheless, you can get people really talking about this service. And then I think Andy has the answer is how do you reach out to a broader array of possible voters and passengers?
Everything that Jim said, plus partnership. I think, partnering and identifying who your grass top levels are, who your champions are at the variety of different local government levels, because ultimately this is selling a project to the local governments for us, because the local governments are going to have to vote and the constituents are going to have to vote for the funding in order to pay for it. So that's a major part of this as well.
Thanks. And this question, I'm going to slip this one in. It just came in, but I'm going to slip it in because Jim just mentioned the Winter Park Express. But Maxwell asks, are there any lessons learned from reestablishing the Winter Park Express that you feel are applicable or useful in the push that you're in now?
Well, I think I mentioned one, and that is getting the public more familiar with passenger rail. It's very effective. I don't know, maybe we've already achieved that this year since we now have a legislation and a governor supporting our passenger rail initiative. But also I think it opens Amtrak's eyes to expansion. You know, Amtrak, we've talked with Amtrak now about expanding rail further into the state, having summer bicycle recreational service, and then eventually our governor's very interested in having a mountain rail regular passenger service up into the interior of the state. So I think the lessons learned are, hey, we can do this. We can negotiate with the Union Pacific Railroad to run passenger trains on their line. Obviously, Amtrak knows how to do that, and we're learning how to do that ourselves. So it just it really does demonstrate the possibilities that we might achieve. And beyond that, then come the political questions that all have to be ironed out, of course. How do we finance it? In Colorado, as Andy's already said, because of our tax legislation and everything else, you know, we're viewed as kind of I guess a purple state, generally speaking, but our state doesn't like taxes. I'll tell you that much. And so we might be viewed as somewhat of a blue state or a purple state. Getting a tax measure through is extremely difficult in this state, and you better have really strong, powerful arguments. So I think that's why we stay visionary and aspirational until we actually have the numbers that we can use to convince the public.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of taxes, thank you. Speaking of taxes, Roger in Chicago asks a couple of questions about the financing and things related. Andy, you know, you spoke about the sales tax, but Roger asks, what types of taxes can the district levy? Are there, you know, income taxes, property taxes, or others that are, you know, potentials here?
So we have the ability to raise a sales and use tax as well as property taxes. We also have an ability to work with local governments around creating an improvement district around a station area. And so that could be another layer of focused taxation for the local communities in order to develop the station area. Just a very brief side note, you know, we are focusing on the state tax because other tax policy in Colorado artificially deflated property taxes in the past. The legislature got rid of that and the voters approved that in the past. So now property taxes have increased. So property taxes isn't necessarily a politically viable opportunity for us to go after. There's also other political reasons around that. So we're focusing on the sales and use tax. That will probably most likely be the revenue generation.
Okay. And speaking of revenue, let's talk about fares for a moment. Roger also asked, do you have plans for fare integration with RTD and Amtrak?
Great questions. Looking at it, we don't know yet. We're not there yet. Obviously, having conversations around that, initial conversations to discuss that. the discussions and the planning around that joint collaboration on that northwest portion of the rail, that phase one, that's where I think we'll really start getting into what could that look like? What does the RTD have available for opportunities? What do we have? I would love it to be able to take advantage of as much technology and make it as simple as possible for riders to be able to utilize this. We obviously want it to be clear that when you step onto this train, you know what to expect, whether that's a commuter or an intercity passenger rail train. So a lot of questions yet to be answered, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thanks. Sean asked a question about frequency, which I think you told us as much as you could at this stage, but also he and Charles both wanted to know more about connections to Denver's airport. Is there more to say about that?
Only in that the passenger with the front range passenger rail won't go to DIA, but we will have the connection at Denver Union Station for RTD, which already has the light rail that goes out to DIA with the A line. And so, you know, I've heard already from a couple of folks that they're really excited to be able to fly into Denver, take the train to Denver Union Station, hop on a front range passenger rail train, and go down to Pueblo or go up to Fort Collins and never have to rent a car in the first place. So yeah, that would be our connection, but we won't have direct access with front range passenger rail to the airport.
Yeah, if I can emphasize that, I was supposed to go to an event in Pueblo a couple of weeks ago that unfortunately I had to cancel.
Yeah, yeah.
But if I could have at least done that, it would have made the trip more doable than less likely of being canceled.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about the freight railroads. Hogan asks, how will BNSF and UP work with passenger rail to ensure that the trains are not being slowed down by freight traffic?
Oh, they love us. They, it's been fascinating to come to this conversation. It's a two-part district, right? It's not a two-part district, it's one district, but we've got UP south of Denver primarily and BNSF along that northern part. Different companies, different cultures, different outlooks towards passenger rail, different outlooks towards Amtrak, different everything, it seems like. So it's a two-prong approach towards the railroad negotiation. It's the same as all of you negotiating with the freight railroads as well. I think it may be a little bit more challenging here because we are starting from scratch. We don't have the kind of legislative state budget that is able to dedicate hundreds of millions of dollars in order to provide that upfront capital that that smooths a lot of railroad negotiations, because obviously money can talk. So if you don't have a lot of money in order to bring to the table for the freight railroads, realistically and logically and justifiably, they're going to look at us and be like, I'm sorry, what's the value that you're bringing to this proposal? Until we are able to pass that ballot measure, it does provide a bit of an opportunity for the railroads to sit back and say, come to me when you're ready. But with that said, they are negotiating, or they are engaging with us during our service development plan. As I mentioned, we have gotten the NDAs with them, and we are getting the data. So they are working with us, but it's working with the freight railroads.
How are your current operations funded? Is it general revenue?
For
Yeah,
the
legislative
district?
appropriations.
Yeah.
I don't know. This next question, I'm not sure if this is your domain or not, but Coco asks, has the RTD Flatiron Flyer BRT delayed the extension of the B line from Westminster to Boulder? And if so, when is it expected to open?
I'm not going to tackle that, Andy. That's not our business per se. It has a bearing on it, obviously.
Yeah, it does. The only thing I will say on that is that the Flatiron Flyer is a very useful transit, bus. It brings a lot of folks in between Boulder and Denver. And we often get a corresponding question about, if we establish an intercity rail along this corridor, what does that do to the Flatiron Flyer? We're not going to, the people will be riding the Flatiron Flyer, and we don't want to do any harm to the existing transit services that are in existence. So this gets to that conversation about frequency and ridership. What is it that we are going to be building along this corridor in order to complement the Flatiron Flyer and make it a better use of transit for the whole system? So that's the only thing I'd add.
Thanks. Frederick in Salt Lake City has a comment that sets up a question. He says, it's quite ironic that Denver has a beautiful central train station, but no front range service. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Rockies, Salt Lake City has the front range service, but no beautiful central station. He says, maybe with the Rio Grande plan and this project in Denver, we'll see both cities complement each other. Maybe the governors could go visit each other's states. And he said, or asks, is there any movement to get the two state governments to meet with each other to discuss what each can learn from the other state?
Well, do you want to do that? Well, I'll just say that thanks to the Union Pacific Railroad, thanks to the fact that the state owns the Moffett Tunnel on the UP's Moffett subdivision, and thanks to the fact that the UP is now moving oil from Utah across the state of Colorado to get to markets in the east and the southeast. Yeah, there's a lot of conversation going on between the two states about safety and environmental concerns and train movements and all the rest. The UP is engaged with the state of Colorado to negotiate a new lease for use of the Moffett Tunnel. That lease expires, I think, January 1st, 2026. It was, I guess, a 50-year lease. I can't remember exactly now, 25 or 50 years. So, yeah, we're engaged. The state is engaged, I should say. Andy's described how Front Range Rail is engaged about passenger rail north and south, but the state of Colorado is engaged east to west. And one of the prime movers, of course, is on the UP line. So what comes out of that remains to be seen. There's a movement in this state to stop transporting oil across the state, but I don't think that's going to materialize because the commodities is too valuable economically to stop shipping it. But nevertheless, making sure that it's safe and all the rest and doesn't in any way damage any of our freshwater supplies. We're a headwater state. I think water coming out of Colorado serves 40 million people. And it's unbelievable how important that our snowpack is and our river system is to the rest of the nation. So having oil trains coming through does raise a lot of questions, and we just need to make sure those trains are handled very safely. That goes back to the point Andy made earlier, that there are ways that we can work with the freight railroads to improve safety. And when it also might enhance the ability of that freight railroad to support passenger rail, then we have an argument to negotiate and do business. So a tremendous, again, this is somewhat aspirational, but a tremendous set of opportunities exist in the state of Colorado and beyond. And Utah, insofar as the east-west route is concerned, yeah, Utah would have to be a part of that.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more question here. Rini asks about speed, saying high-speed rail is usually defined as around 200 miles an hour. Do your plans include that or reach for higher speeds like that?
No, and this is really interesting. We won't be a high-speed rail. We are doing some modeling right now, as I mentioned before, looking to use existing infrastructure as the starter service. There are some areas where in the future we could do some double tracking. As usual, when we get through some of these major markets along, especially the Northwest sub up there north of Denver, we are constrained and we would probably have to do some taking. So obviously we want to avoid that at the beginning. In regards to speeds, what we have initially seen, two quick things. One, initial modeling shows that we can get up to 79 miles an hour, generally because of the dynamics, the stations, and the geography, topography of the tracks. If we get above that, it doesn't necessarily result in a large time savings for the corridor, roughly a 3.5 minute savings time. So we're looking at getting as many, as fast as possible on what we can, and then providing the frequency that accompanies that in order to make it successful. In addition to that, in our statute, we are required to provide speeds that are comparable to existing traffic patterns and speeds. So driving from Denver to Fort Collins now takes about an hour and a half, depending on traffic. It could take 5 hours, depending on the highway and the conditions. But we are required to match that. We had a demonstration train here a month ago now-ish, and we jumped on that. We didn't get above 55 maybe that whole time, Jim.
At best, Andy.
At best, right? And that was just during the diagonals on the straightaway between Boulder and Longmont. But we were traveling at freight speeds. We left Union Station, and one of my staff members, I had to come back down from Longmont early, and I couldn't take the train back. So she was going to meet me in Longmont. She drove from Denver to Longmont as we took the train from Denver to Longmont. And she only arrived about 5 to 10 minutes before we did, even at the slower speeds along existing infrastructure. So that's just a nice kind of anecdote that makes us feel good that there is a possibility here for some good speed and competitive travel times.
Great. Well, thank you. Just a couple of final things. Andy, there was a request for you to either put up the slide with your contact information, or I suppose you could put that in the chat. Also, we had a request for a copy of the slides. We'll let you all decide whether you want us to share those afterwards. But for anyone who's interested, within a few days, we'll have a recording of this talk available at hsrail.org/events. And also, the Front Range Passenger Rail District has also produced a great video about the project, and I will put a link to that in the chat as well. And with that, Rick, any final thoughts?
No, just thank you guys. This has been really informative. I really appreciate it. Thanks to the audience members and thanks to Tom. I'm going to be disappointed to have the N700 model leave the office, but thank you, Tom, for making the donation today. And again, if you enjoyed this, hsrail.org/donate. And thanks to everybody for participating today.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.